we're going to have our last but our not least speakers for the night. We'll have a combined presentation from Miss Maxine Alleyne-Esprit and Karina Gomez. They are from the International Organization for Migration. And Miss Maxine Alleyne-Esprit is a communication and community engagement specialist with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. She focuses on disaster placement and rights-based approaches to human security in the Caribbean. Ms. Karina Gomez is a Senior Migration, Environment, and Climate Change Associate at IOM Regional Office in Panama. She specializes in participatory project design and Indigenous community engagement around climate change, migration, and sustainability. Their presentation will focus on disaster displacement and climate mobility. Please welcome Ms. Maxine Alleyne-Esprit and Ms. Karina Gomez. Over to you both.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Good evening to all of the listeners. We're so happy to be here this evening. I am Maxine. I am based in Dominica, but I work with the IOM Caribbean office, which is based in Barbados. And my colleague, Karina, is based in Panama. And so we are representing the South, right? So we're going to present this evening on dimensions of resilience, which of course is the theme, and looking at disaster displacement and forced migration. I will focus on the Caribbean, on some case studies from the Caribbean, and Karina will focus on the Gunayala Indigenous community off the coast of Panama. Yeah, so just to give some data, because very often we find that we think we have a good sense of the situation, but really we don't have an overall look, and we don't understand really what the magnitude of things is. So in terms of disaster displacement trends in the Caribbean, in 2024, which is the most recent, Hurricane Beryl displaced at least 1,781 people in formal and informal shelters in the Caribbean. Between 2012 and 2022, looking at that decade, we see that 5.3 million, there were 5.3 million new internal displacements. So that is within country from one community to another, caused by environmental disasters registered in the Caribbean. In 2020, we had hurricanes Laura, Eta, and Iota, where 2.7 million people were displaced in 14 countries. So that's sort of a wider region. And in 2010, of course, we know the earthquake in Haiti displaced about 6.5 million people. So those are just some figures that we are sharing. Next slide. I'm going to allow some Caribbean nationals to tell their own stories. So these are some videos that we compiled for a conference a couple of years ago. This is 2023 information, I believe, and it looks at cases in Dominica, St. Vincent, Montserrat. So these are women sharing their own stories of displacement, and we will see some themes kind of arising out of those.
After 9 months, we moved back to Dominica because one, we wanted to come back home, and then our living arrangements was temporary, and still we was getting some issue with our auntie because it's like, children will be children, and then she doesn't normally have to deal with children on a normal basis, like a living basis, so it was starting to get challenging for her. Now that we are back home, it's still difficult because we actually get back our house, we just have to live in the workshop.
The only thing that I could do was pack up the kids, and at the time the ferry was coming in get up really early and just go there hoping that I could get a space with the kids. It wasn't even guaranteed, but I just had to try. And I did get on. My baby at the time, I didn't even have a birth paper or anything for him. So it's a good thing I knew somebody who wrote up a document, and then luckily I had a ping pong of the baby, so they just gave me a document that I could use to travel with him.
Normally, procedures, plans, guidelines that are supposed to be used in terms of evacuating persons. And in order to ensure the guidelines, the plans and procedures that are used for evacuations actually work, it is important to test them through simulation exercises.
Evacuation simulation should be conducted as a means of testing the people, and even to look at the, how we could say, the loopholes, the bottlenecks that arise, that give a chance for evaluation, so that we could correct some things that may have gone bad in the event of a real hazard.
At that time, my mother, sister, and brother lived in town. And so they moved over to where I lived. But the eruptions continued and they progressively got worse. It was really crowded, but we had to do what we had to do. And at that time, I had a 10-year-old daughter who had epilepsy and a 3-year-old son. And I just considered him to be a baby. Because...
Oh. All right, is the video stuck? We were just actually coming up to 2 cases from Montserrat, and the Montserrat experience was very intense because the eruption affected, it's a very small island, and the eruption affected...
I have the prospect of having to live in a church, a school, or under a tent. I can't do that, not with a daughter with epilepsy and a baby. And the nightmares on top of that, and I decided, no, I needed to leave. So I decided to leave and go to the UK.
I was living in the because I was married to a police. We had this girl, a school child, who had to be on her own most of the time when we were evacuating, when we were on call and stuff like that. When we had that heavy ash fall, all the thunder, the lightning, the whole place turning black, all of us being scared. I applied for housing. When I went to the housing department, I was told we knew nothing of the Montserrat situation, so I was literally turned away. I would have liked for people like me, who were called essential services workers, to have a special place that you and your family can inhabit or live, that there were procedures in place instructing us of what to do if you had a family. If you were single, this is what you do. If you have a family, this is what is available for you and for your family.
So we had the pandemic, then we would have had the dengue, then we would have had the volcanic eruption, we would have had floods just after the volcanic eruptions, where we saw some of the first heavy lahars coming down towards the end of April. We had our first explosive eruption on April the 9th, 22nd thereabout, with explosive eruptions. Most of our shelters are schools and churches, community centers, learning resource centers. So we do activate those systems, that system, the shelter management system, open our doors for persons who may need a place to shelter. That's in the before and immediately after the impact. So it was the first time at least in our operations here at NEMO, as we were established in 2002, that we have had some shelters being operated that long, and we still have a few persons around in one particular shelter remaining. And Our government had a policy of supporting persons who have been displaced from disasters over the years. We have had the housing program and rehabilitation program where homes are rehabilitated, homes are rebuilt, and people are relocated from dangerous areas, from riverbeds. From the volcanic eruption, one of the first things that we recommended and we did was to clearly have the physical planning department do the mapping exercise to determine which areas would be unsafe for rebuilding, because we know the volcano is going to erupt again, whether it's in my lifetime or someone else's lifetime. It's going to erupt again, and we do not want development taking place in these same areas that the lahars are going to come down, the pyroclastic flows are going to come down.
All right, so what we see from these stories and what we see from experience generally is that you have an environmental hazard, but there are different levels of exposure based on physical space, based on economic situation, based on family income, based on gender. We see also that you add on to that all the different vulnerabilities, and then what you get is that you have an amplified risk of disaster and displacement when you have multiple vulnerabilities. And gender and Indigenous people, those are two of the factors. We also find that people with disabilities also have very specific vulnerabilities that they experience, and that affects the impacts of disaster and displacement on them. Next. Coming out of the stories that we just looked at, some of the themes that we see coming out. Very often we choose, the first choice is normally to stay with family and friends. However, in experience, we find that staying with family and friends, there's a short-term experience and there's a long-term experience. And particularly when you are leaving country, you're going off island, you're going to a different country, so you have cross-border movement, you find that the risk of abuse, of sexual violence, of gender-based violence, of child abuse, emotional, financial violence, abuse can be increased. We also find that sometimes there's a loss of access. So sometimes people are reluctant to move because you lose access to potential government assistance, for instance, in your place of origin, if you move. And so there's almost an incentive for the family to be separated, right? Access to documentation came up, including for children and newborns. In that circumstance, there was a newborn. So she didn't yet have any kind of birth papers, but luckily she had a picture. Now, luckily also, she is a citizen of the OECS. And so the policies sometimes can assist. So the fact that there's freedom of movement within the OECS countries meant that several people affected by Hurricane Maria found it easy to move with their license, for instance, or their social security card, even if their passport may have been lost. I was one of those. I ended up having to travel on my license to St. Lucia, right? And because we're citizens of the OECS, basically, there were no limitations to the length of time that we could stay. We did not need work permits. It was much easier. We were able to access education. So several women, including myself again, moved to different OECS countries so that our children could resume school, because this was 1 week after the beginning of the school year. The decision to move often is affected by the responsibility of care. So we saw in the situation in Montserrat, for instance, that she was speaking about the fact that she had a child with epilepsy, and she had a young baby as well, and there was no way she could live in a shelter with those challenges. It also means, though, that sometimes going to work is a challenge. So with Charmaine, we saw her husband was a policeman. She is a teacher. She had to go to teach. She had to go back to work. But then it meant that the daughter that they had was left in the police station on her own. And that was not a situation that she was comfortable with. So she felt she had to move. Now, what we found with some of the Montserrat stories actually is that they went to the UK because there was the opportunity for them to move. But one, there was no real system in place for them there. Two, there was a real culture shock, the temperature, the food, the level of discrimination. And so when you look at those stories in the long term, you find broken marriages, you find children where, you have a family with 3 children. One ends up being a drug addict. The other one ends up committing suicide. The other one ends up, some really sad long-term situations. Whereas from the Caribbean, we're sitting home and we forget, oh, these people have gone to the UK, so they're well off, right? And so you find that there are these situations that we don't often take consideration of. In emergency shelters with climate change, what we find is longer stays. And so you see in Dominica, for instance, that you have purpose-built emergency shelters now, and there is an even greater need for shelter management and rights-based shelter management that looks at gender and different, access, different bathrooms, for instance, and lighting around the bathrooms and making sure that children can be taken care of when parents may go off to work. Physical planning. So one of the things that I noted with the last speaker was that, of course, after the eruption in St. Vincent, one of the main things that they looked at was physically, where might the volcano affect again? But the considerations of the other aspects, like livelihoods, like community bonds and access to resources, those things don't necessarily take front stage at this point. So the full sort of human security approach to disaster displacement is something that is not yet fully being considered. Next slide. I'm going to just run through this very, very quickly. I'll share some resources afterwards. Our research has found that gender is a fundamental factor in displacement impact. We find that disaster situations, when there's displacement and when there are temporary accommodations being provided, there is a need for gender responsive interventions. We can move on to the next slide. I know our time is short, so I don't want to go too much into detail. We also find that there can be limited access to resources and opportunities, and that can affect gender-specific vulnerabilities and the ability of women, let's say, to return to their communities of origin, because they are the caretakers, they are the ones, they may be the single income earner working, taking care of the children, and so they're unable to return to their communities of origin because they cannot afford to have a break in income. Gender-based violence is a critical issue in all situations of displacement. We also find that there's a need for improved evidence and data so that we can really understand the situation. And this is becoming even more important because with climate change and our small islands or small land masses that are often more and more, we are seeing the entire country can be affected by one event. And so it kind of forces cross-border movement. And how do we take care of data in that kind of situation if data is not comparable? So if you leave country A to go to country B, but they're unable to sort of share data and compare, then it can create a not so ideal situation. We need to create opportunities to promote and recognize women's knowledge, Indigenous knowledge and leadership, and just to recognize as well that responding to the needs of marginalized groups requires consideration of multiple and compounded vulnerabilities. The next few slides share some resources, research that has been done and that is available. I'm sure that can be shared at a later time, but it is just to let you know that if you are really interested in the topic, there's several documents that IOM has provided, and several studies that we've been involved in that can give you more information on some of the issues arising around gender and displacement of communities. The final one is a knowledge hub. You can move to the next slide. I don't want to spend time. So this one has some policy papers that have been done by civil society organizations that we liaise with. And the final one, go on to the next slide, please, is the knowledge management hub, right? So this one is kmhub.iom.int, and that is a regional knowledge management hub on migration where you can find a repository of a lot of this data. So I'm going to hand on now to Karina. Karina is going to walk us through the Gunayala experience. The next slide just gives contact with IOM Caribbean. Like us, follow us, look for us. And Karina, the presentation actually just continues on to Karina's own.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. As Maxine Alleyne-Esprit. My name is Karina Gomez. I'm a Senior Migration, Environment and Climate Change Associate at the IOM Regional Office in Panama. I'm based in Panama City and I am Panamanian. And today I'd like to share a little bit of the experience of Gardisadup. Gardisadup, next slide please. Gardisadup is a small low-lying island of the Gunayala comarca. It's the home about 1,300 people. And for years, the island has faced rising sea levels, overcrowding, and prolonged flooding. Storms have damaged home, school, health services, and at the same time, access to safe drinking water and sanitation have become more difficult, increasing the health risks. But beyond, next one, please. But beyond the environmental pressure, we must also acknowledge the deeper root of the vulnerability shaped by historic inequality, because this Gunayala is an indigenous comarca, indigenous community here in Panama. Next one. What's truly stand out about the Gardisadup relocation is that the relocation process was not imposed. The community started the process more than 10 years ago through the Guna Congress and the traditional leaders. They identified land in the mainland and began working on vision for the relocation that reflects their own priorities. This local ownership ensured that the process respect their values, their traditional knowledge, and the way of life. And is that key reason why the relocation moved forward, even amid the delays that they have. Next one. Some of the challenge, well, still the road was far away from easy. In 2017, the government commitment to support the relocation, promising to build 300 houses and basic infrastructure. And that delays, followed by 2023, many critical services were still missing, and home lacked culturally appropriate features like a space for extended families or bins to hang hammocks. The hammocks play a significant role for them because the hammocks serving as a connection between the physical world and their spiritual belief. And in the new houses, they don't feel well because they don't have that connection. And the school also remained in this island, so the children have to return daily by boat. There was no running water, no operational health center, in many cases, no job, because they depended on the fishing. The cosmology and the spiritual connection to the sea, that is a central identity and livelihood of the Gunas, was disrupted. Something that was a huge challenge was the language, because language was another barrier. Most of the residents of Gardisadup speak Guna. They don't speak Spanish, and many elders in the community have limited formal education. And this made it hard to fully engage with the authorities and to understand the technical plans. Also because the elders are considered in the Guna culture as the people who are wise, and they believe that they didn't have the opportunity to speak. And also some documents were translated into Kuna. The translation didn't achieve optimal effectiveness and also have problems at the moment of the translation because the Guna is a complex language and not everybody have the ability to translate in a proper way. This experience left behind mixed feelings of ashamed, but also frustration, and the need for a greater inclusion and follow through. Next one, please. Some lessons for the region is that the case of Gartisado offer important insights. It demonstrates that the planet relocation should be carried out with human right-based approach, one that prioritizes community leadership, participation, and dignity. It also underscored the need for national government to develop clear national plans and policies that go beyond housing, ensuring access to services, cultural continuity, and long-term well-being. And lastly, it highlights the role of the international actors in supporting the process by supporting as technical support, but not to replacing the local capacity. Next one, please. And looking ahead, it's essential to ensure that any relocation process is carried out with integrity in a manner that is dignified and transparent and inclusive. Infrastructure must be both climate resilient and cultural appropriate. And moreover, Gartisado may serve as an important reference point for informing borders, regional and national policies that promote climate justice and address issues related to human mobility. And it reminds us that the adaptation must go hand in hand with justice, and that when communities lead the process, the real solutions are possible. So that's all, and thank you very much for all your attention. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Miss Maxine and Karina, for your rich perspective. Both of you basically connected the dots between climate, migration, and human security. For me, and for everyone else, very clear. You know, you guys gave us so much to think about as we plan for mobility and resilience. Those videos were very, very touching. And this, tells us that we should basically continue the work that we're doing to effect changes in our different communities and in our different countries. We're going to invite all the speakers to come back on camera, and we're going to jump right into our Q&A. I see your questions in the comments, and we don't forget them. We are going to address them right now. I'm going to invite all the speakers to come back on camera, and I will just highlight some of the questions that were posted in the chat. The latest one was addressed to Ms. Maxine and Karina from the presentations that you guys shared. And the question from the chat says that this has been a learning experience. Are the disasters management organization in the islands aware of the studies and learnings that you guys shared? So that's a question.
Yes. So actually the video, when I was preparing the presentation, I was putting together different things. And then I maybe 2 nights ago, when I should have been sleeping, I suddenly remembered this video that we used at a technical workshop of disaster management organizations from all the OECS countries that we held in St. Lucia. So the OECS, I would have to say, which is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, for those of you who may not know, it's a smaller grouping within the CARICOM region. So the OECS is probably, I would say, a little more advanced in terms of regional planning for cross-border displacement due to disasters, because we've seen it happen. We've seen it happen after Hurricane Irma. The entire island of Barbuda had to be relocated to Antigua. A week later, we had Hurricane Maria. So you had people from Tortola moving, you had people from Anguilla moving, from Barbuda moving, you had people from Dominica. Dominica, the entire country was basically affected. So you had people from Dominica moving. And so it was a real first time experience of that kind of massive cross-border movement within the Eastern Caribbean. And so the governments have realized that, look, we kind of need to plan for this, because with climate change, this is potentially going to happen more often. And then what we saw in 2021 in St. Vincent was the eruption of the volcano. And on top of that came COVID. And on top of that came hurricane. So you had this multiplicity of potential disasters. You did not know what was going to happen with the volcano. How large was the eruption going to be? Was there going to need to be off-island evacuation? And so it really is something that the Eastern Caribbean governments, the OECS governments, have seen as a major priority. So there's been a ministerial declaration. IOM has been very involved in that work in terms of raising the awareness of all the human security issues that surround displacement. And now the conversation is kind of expanding through wider into the CARICOM states. So yes, it is something that we are advocating very much in terms of those broader impacts of disaster displacement.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do hope, there was a question says, are these stories on the IOM Caribbean YouTube channel? I do hope, because these stories need to reach a wider audience. And I remember, from Kville, listening to some of my friends who went through that Maria situation and listening to them. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to learn, that there are movements that are out there reaching persons. Another important question from Amanda Harris Logie said, what about disabled persons that are displaced during natural disasters? What about them? Are, initiatives being put in place for them? And I'm going to ask Dr. Paula to respond to this, because I remember she spoke about the ramps that were there at the schools, because a lot of shelters around the Caribbean, they don't really have ramps. Bathrooms are not well suited for persons with disabilities. So Dr. Henry, you could touch on that a little bit for us.
Okay, yeah, I will touch on that. But, I have a question. I will touch on that because we realize the importance of taking care of disabled persons is something we must plan short term and long term. But I actually have a question for, is it Maria?
Maxine?
For me? The last person who presented, right? No,
Maxine,
I can't remember the person who talked about disabled persons, because actually I just did a study in Barbuda, Hurricane Irma, 6 years later. And one of the things we found out from talking to the persons who had to undergo forced migration was that there was no real system in place for vulnerable populations. There was the population at large, but there was no systems in place for vulnerable populations, including people with mental health disorders. So I would like the panel to tell me a little bit more about that, because we're now writing on the study.
I didn't specifically speak about people with disabilities, but yes, it is an area that we are kind of looking more into, and we are sort of strengthening our relationships with CSOs, with NGOs that are dealing with people with disabilities. So that's an area that we are sort of beginning to go more deeply into. But we do see that definitely from for instance, a communication standpoint, that our disaster communications tend not to take people with disabilities into account. And so they end up moving very last minute, or not moving at all, because sometimes they're not even aware of what is going on. We also see that, well, in Dominica, for sure, with the new emergency shelters that are being built, because they're purpose-built as emergency shelters, they're being built with accessibility in mind. But it is definitely an issue that, throughout the Caribbean, we are not where we need to be.
So thank you for that. Yeah, one of the things we're trying to come out of this research that we're doing is to develop policies to deal with the vulnerable population women especially. Yes, thank you very much. Nicole, who spoke about that, we found that as a problem. And so for women and girls and also the vulnerable population to trying to get policy change out of that from Antigua Barbuda, we're trying to let the paper speak to that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henry and Miss Maxine, for that. Emma Lois have a question. She asks, what role did NGOs and community-based organizations play in the evacuations in Dominica and resettlements? I think it was Maxine who basically, the video that was played highlighting the different stories for the persons. Do you have an idea of what roles the NGOs or the community-based organizations played in the evacuations and resettlements of the people there?
What I do know is that what is called local government, which would be the village council system, which is very strong in Dominica. The village councils played a vital role in identifying people and in sort of feeding information to the national system and to the international organizations as well, as to who were some of the most vulnerable people who needed to be, needed rebuilding and that kind of thing. So that's what I can say. I know as well that strong associations such as the Dominica Association of People with Disabilities was very engaged as well.
Thank you so much. And the last question for all panelists, I'm going to ask you guys just to be very brief with your response as we wrap up the Q&A. And the question is, I want everyone to provide one key recommendation for boosting resilience. I'm going to start with Mrs. Nicole Joseph Chen. Miss Chen, over to you. Mrs. Chen, sorry, over to you. What's one recommendation that you
that one recommendation will be, let's collaborate. Collaboration solves everything. It does.
Love that. Love that. All right, we're going to move right along. Dr. Henry, what's yours?
Okay, so my one recommendation is, yes, it is important to do recovery short term, right away at the disaster, but we also need to think of long-term recovery from the people, not just,
Thank you very much. Miss Maxine, what's yours?
Mine would be that in considering relocation and displacement and that kind of thing, that we must consider not only the physical needs and the physical vulnerability of the area, but also individual needs and human security.
Thank you very much. Karina, what's one word you would say to boost resilience? What's your one word? Can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry. One word, I say local community and traditional knowledge.
Love that. Local community and traditional knowledge. Is Ivy still with us?
I'm here.
Perfect. Ivy, what's your one word to boost resilience?
Mine is actually a statement. Let's keep the conversation going.
All right. We love that. Let's keep the conversation going. And what a great way to close day one of our 3-day session. And so as we wrap up tonight's session, we just want to say, this is how we build and will continue to build resilience. Together, all the voices that you heard tonight prove to us that, guess what? Resilience, it's not just a concept. It's lived every day. Thank you to our phenomenal speakers, our sponsors, and most importantly, Miss Derval and Dana Lynn for, turning this into a great experience. And guess what? We want you guys to rest up because tomorrow we're back with even more energy for Power in Her Hands. You don't want to miss it.